Um, what we've been doing at Venta since really 2005 is investigating the walled town at Caistor and its surroundings. And I suppose as an archaeologist, one of the things that I've become particularly interested in relation to Caistor is the way in which archaeologists have sort of brought their own ideas and prejudices to the interpretation of evidence and the sort of strategies that they've kind of adopted towards it. And Caistor's a particularly sort of interesting example of this because of the extent to which ideas about Boudica, the Boudican revolt, the Iceni, and the impact of the revolt have influenced interpretation of the site. And I'm going to look at this particularly in relation to the street grid, because you're the Roman roads group, and streets are really the closest thing I've got to roads. I do think roads have a really interesting role in the way that particular interpretations of Roman Britain have played out. Every school child knows that the Romans built straight roads, even if often they didn't. And roads exercise a sort of peculiar fascination, I think, hence the existence of the Roman Roads Association. And I can't think of many other examples of infrastructure that have these sorts of interest groups dedicated to it. We might come back to this later on. So the streets of Caistor are probably its most prominent feature, and they appear as parch marks every so often, like Brigadoon in the Mist for our older viewers. And they were the feature that first sparked attention in 1928 when a series of iconic aerial photographs were taken of the site. Until the late 2000s, all the plans of the site derived from aerial photographs. And so I'm going to start by looking at the development of these plans in a little more detail. And my screen has stopped working, which is great. Okay, so enough of this frustration. So the first plan we have is that drawn up by Mortimer Wheeler in his commentary on the aerial photographs. And this remains the definitive plan until 1971. Donald Atkinson, who excavated from 1929 to 35, never actually replaced Wheeler's plan. When Shepard Frere published the first of his reports on Atkinson's excavation on the forum, he produced a new plan of the site, which hopefully we will see in a second. Right. Apologies, this has stopped working.
What's the problem, Will?
The slides aren't moving.
Have you tried using the arrow buttons on the keyboard?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Right, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. I'm really sorry about this. Right, can you see some slides and are they moving?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Looking good.
So I'm really sorry about this. So we've got a plan drawn up by Wheeler in 1929. And this remained the plan of the site until 1971, when Shepherd Frere published the first of his reports on Atkinson's excavations on the Forum. And as part of this, he produced a new plan of the site, which we can see on the bottom left here. Frere's revised plan was partly derived from Wheeler and partly from his attempts to fit Atkinson's excavation plans into the aerial photograph evidence, because Atkinson never actually plotted the actual position of his excavation trenches. Frere's plan and the aerial photographs were in turn used as a basis for the Norfolk Archaeological Trust's plan of the site in 1992. And this replaced the Frere plan as the standard depiction of the site. And it appears, for example, in the 1995 edition of Waiture's Towns of Roman Britain. As a plan, it contains a range of inaccuracies and is quite problematic, but we won't dwell on that here. Although they vary in detail, all the published plans include a number of features in common. All include an east-west street in the south of the walled area. Can you see my cursor?
Yes, we can see that.
Yeah. So it's this street here, and you can see it appears on Frere's plan, and it appears on the Norfolk Archaeological Trust plan. Interestingly, this street is in fact not a street at all. It's a ploughed out hedge. And this was recognised by local archaeologist Ernest Kent when he drew up the aerial photographs in an original plan for the Eastern Daily Press. And Kent was familiar with the site and recognised that there was no street there and it was a ploughed out hedge, as is very clearly visible on the present aerial photographs and indeed on the 1929 aerial photographs. Now, I think what Frere, Wheeler and Atkinson were perhaps trying to do was subconsciously create a more even, a more regular looking Roman town than was actually the case. What it did, there was a series of half insulae to the north of the Forum, and the invented street created identical half insulae to the south of the Forum, therefore making a more regular street plan. I think another result of the successive redrawings was that the streets have become progressively straighter. Equally, all the plans include the town walls, notwithstanding the fact that these are a later addition and are anachronistic in any depiction of the town before the 3rd century. So the result is a graphic depiction, a series of graphic depictions of the town in which it appears to be more planned and regimented than the evidence actually suggests. Although it should be remembered, in fairness, that none of these plans were really intended to be more than schematic representations of the site. The geophysical survey of the town that we've carried out in stages since about 2006 has demonstrated that the street grid is actually much less regular than the published plans suggest. The streets vary in width and the alignments of some have clearly shifted over time. And I think what the published plans of the site actually reflect are deeply held 20th century beliefs about what a Roman town should look like, rather than what it actually did look like. And the actual picture is very different, as we'll get onto in a minute. So for many years, it was held that the street grid of Caistor dated to the period immediately following the Boudican revolt. Unlike the evolution of the plans, the evolution of this idea is quite interesting to trace. The dating of Venta Icenorum to the 70s AD, 7 or so, was first suggested by Francis Haverfield, who furnished quite a comprehensive description of the site in the Norfolk volume of the Victoria History of the Counties of England. And based on the evidence of coins, he suggested that its Roman life commenced during the 20 or 30 years of the 1st century. And Haverfield's dating was followed by Atkinson, who dated the street grid to about 70 AD, when, according to him, the process of pacification, which followed the revolt of Boudica in 61, was complete. This dating to the 70s AD was repeated by Atkinson on multiple occasions using almost identical language, with newspaper reports suggesting that his view was fairly firmly established very early in his excavations. It's repeated by Christopher Hawkes in his 1949 overview of the site, written in consultation with Atkinson, in which he says again that the town will have been founded under the Roman policy of pacification after Boudica's revolt had been suppressed. So this idea of the foundation of the town and the laying out of the streets in the 70s in the immediate post-Boudican period has been repeated many times and remained canonical in much of the secondary literature on Roman Britain, as well as the literature on Boudica. Donald Atkinson, in fact, dug a number of sections through the streets and concluding that they dated to AD 70. And here we can see what the streets look like in Atkinson's sections. We can see the multiple layers of road surfacing and these wide open central drains that run down the centre of the streets and are in fact clearly visible on the geophysics and the aerial photographs. His date of AD 70, however, is quite interesting in that there seems to be no evidence for it at all. All the evidence from his excavations, and I've compiled it in this image here, show that the street grid from his own trenches is unlikely to be any earlier than about AD 120. This evidence derives from a number of sections that Atkinson dug through the streets. And his dating, his continued insistence on AD 70 seems to reflect his thinking about the pacification of the Iceni in the aftermath of the revolt, rather than the evidence from the trenches. So when the current Caistor project commenced in 2006, one of the stated objectives was to investigate the origins of the town, including the date of the street grid. Given the problems with Atkinson's dating, it was clearly of fundamental importance to clarify when the streets were laid out and to investigate whether they did in fact reflect a unified urban project. And so to this end, following the geophysical survey of the town, two sections of the street grid were selected for excavation. The first was the diagonal street in the top right hand of the northeastern corner, and we excavated where on this plan you can see the number 2 where my cursor is. This street has always stood out from the rest of the town plan due to the fact that it runs at an angle of approximately 45 degrees to the rest of the street grid. It commenced at what appears from the aerial photographs and geophysical survey to be a large, possibly metalled precinct flanked by 2 temples excavated by Atkinson in 1929. And from those temples, it runs out northeast of the town to the major extra-mural temple site that has been the subject of the Caistor project's excavations over the last few years. So one function of this street seems to be to use, to link 2 of Caistor's principal cult areas. And the striking angle of this road led to suggestions that it actually predated the rest of the street grid. And indeed, one reason for excavating a section through it was to test this hypothesis and investigate whether, for example, it represented an Iron Age trackway. So here you can see the top of this street as we revealed it just below the plough soil. You can clearly see the metalled surface and a large wheel rut running through as a dark line in the immediate foreground. Going down through it, we revealed at least 8 layers of road metalling and resurfacing. And finds from the lower levels were very limited, but nothing earlier than the 2nd century in terms of pottery was found immediately beneath the road. And you can see in this trench, there's a sort of dark sandy layer, dirty sandy layer immediately underneath the road. And this produced second, fairly poorly dated, but second century pot. These initial layers of road surfacing were overlain by thick bands of silt, and you can see one in the section here. And this silt was then overlain by further layers of road metalling, presumably to repair the damage caused by the rutting that we can see in a number of different sections. And this is the section through the diagonal street. The later surfaces seem to go over these thick accumulated layers of silt, and this results in the road becoming ever wider, reaching an eventual width of around 10 meters. And this sort of similar sequences of silts and widening roads have been noted at other sites, for example, Cirencester and Canterbury. And the latest surface that we found on this street dated to no earlier than the 4th century. So we've got a sequence of street laying here, which runs seemingly from the 2nd through to the 4th century. We also investigated a second area of street on the northwest side of the site. Here again, we can see the topmost layer of street surfacing quite high beneath the plough soil. In this case, we actually found a large assemblage of pottery from immediately below the road surface. And in this image, you can perhaps see that we are now at the bottom of the road metalling, and there is a very thin layer of road surfacing present, and it's perhaps clearer on the section. And what we seem to have is an unmetalled track of which the earliest phases date to the late 2nd or 3rd century, overlain by 2 layers of gravel road surface. So in this area, this part of the street grid could be no earlier than the late 2nd century. So the evidence for the street grid at Caistor, although variable in quantity and quality, clearly doesn't support the idea that a gridded town plan was laid out as part of a unified urban design in the 70s AD. None of the evidence from Atkinson's investigations and none of the evidence from ours suggested a date as early as AD 70 for the street grid. And as I say, we seem to be looking at sometime in the early 2nd century for the formal layout of the town. And here you can see the streets, not done with the magic of Photoshop, but painted out on the ground by Fred, a retired groundsman from Nottingham Girls' School, as part of our public presentation of the site. We know that at least one of the streets, that in the northwest, was not formalised until the late 2nd century at the earliest. And so I think it can be reasonably argued that the street plan developed rather more gradually. The idea of a more gradual development may also be reflected in variations in the number of gravel surfaces present, metal surfaces. In the excavations, these vary between 2 and 8. And variations in the strength of the anomalies identified by the geophysical survey, also suggests that some streets have a much greater depth of metalling than the others. So the dark, our rough and ready interpretation here is that the darker the lines of the streets on the geophysics, probably the thicker the layers, the more layers of road surfacing we have. And this sort of variation in the numbers of surfaces is noted at many other sites. For example, Cirencester varies from a minimum of 9 surfaces to a maximum of 24 at a point along Ermine Street. And those street surfaces at Cirencester have a depth of about 3 meters. And I think the smaller number of surfaces at Caistor suggests either that the streets were significantly later in date, or that they saw much less use or much less well maintained than those at Cirencester, all of which suggest quite intriguing scenarios. And a view of Caistor which sees its street grid kind of developing incrementally during the 2nd century is certainly comparable with the picture emerging from other towns in Roman Britain, with excavations at Caerwent and Leicester also showing that their street grids are developing well into the 2nd century. So the evidence of the street grid suggests that the long-standing idea of the formal establishment of the town as part of the Roman response to the Boudican revolt is no longer tenable. There is activity at the site in the Flavian period. What we don't have is evidence of a settlement of significant size or with a formal street grid prior to the 2nd century AD. And so although we have material from the site that dates to the 2nd half of the 1st century AD, I think the idea of a formal town has to be put to bed. So why was Atkinson so adamant that Caistor was part of a policy of pacification towards the Iceni following the revolt? The Boudican revolt was very much in the mind of Donald Atkinson and his contemporaries in the late 1920s. The physical evidence of the impact of the rebellion was being uncovered, notably in Colchester, where 1927, so just before the aerial photographs were taken at Caistor, saw the discovery of the so-called 1st and 2nd pottery shops in Colchester. And 1928 saw the recovery of the tombstone of Longinus Statopesi, which was originally thought to have been destroyed by Boudica's rebels, but was actually damaged by workmen. And this was found in 1928, so the year before Donald Atkinson's excavations actually started. So it's clear that Boudica and the activities of the rebels and the impact of the rebellion and its aftermath is very much in the minds of archaeologists in this period. Atkinson would certainly have been aware of these discoveries, which may have contributed to him placing Caistor within a Boudican context. And I think certainly his willingness to see the town as part of the Roman response to the revolt can be put down to this context. As I say, he may also have been strongly influenced by previous thinking about Caistor itself, from firstly Francis Haverfield in 1901 and then Ernest Kent in 1929. And this Kent's comment is one in the for a paper in Norfolk Archaeology to which Atkinson wrote the foreword. And so clearly this idea is circulating. Contemporary ideas that Rome was a civilizing and progressive influence on Britain may also have been a factor. For Atkinson, the excavations ultimately demonstrated the conservative character of the Iceni and the relatively imperfect degree of Romanization to which they attained. And his insistence that the street grid was established in the aftermath of the Boudican revolt can perhaps best be understood in the context of this narrative of civilization versus barbarism. I want to return now, however, to the plans of the site, because I think as archaeologists, we perhaps underestimate the way and the extent to which graphic representations such as this are a factor in the way that we perceive Roman towns. I think all these representations, that of Wheeler, Frere, and subsequently the Norfolk Archaeological Trust, can be interpreted as representations of Rome as a civilizing force. We can also see this, I think, we can see these changing interpretations in other graphic representations of the site. Here's this rather lovely painted image is by Sue White, and this accompanied the, it was done for the Norfolk Archaeological Trust to accompany their first presentation of the site. And I think this represents in some ways that regular gridded plan that we are familiar with from the plans of the site, but also from other reconstructions of Roman towns, the white walls, the tiled roofs, the neat field systems around it. I think there is a sense that this is part of that civilizing narrative that was associated with Rome in the 20th century. We tried to change this through a number of reconstructions. This was one we did with Time Team following the really the geophysical survey and some of the initial excavations. And here we made Caistor far less developed and built up, and we included animals, trees, heaps of dung, and this sort of thing to give a representation of a different type of Roman town. We've taken this a little further in recent years. This was a reconstruction we did for the Norfolk Archaeological Trust 2015 interpretation scheme, again representing animals within the site and also roundhouses, which we have quite good evidence for round structures in Caistor, up until at least the 3rd century AD. Most recently, we've recreated the Forum. This was as part of an AHRC-funded project in 2019 to do a walkthrough virtual representation of Caistor, where you could interact with characters from the town. Now, I'm not saying that all these interpretations, all these reconstructions are based on the best evidence that was available at the time. And these reconstructions represent highly divergent interpretations, but they are really powerful tools. And I think we underestimate our graphic representations of sites, sort of rather at our peril. I'm going to finish with the latest plan of the site. Rather than the playing card of Wheeler and Frere, we now have a bewildering but much richer palimpsest of information, an extraordinary complexity of roads, trackways, field systems, ditches. We have a town that extends far beyond the late Roman walls that have previously, I think, constricted other representations of the town. And I think all these things should remind us that archaeology can only reflect the data that we know about. But I think it also reflects the worldviews of its practitioners. Obviously, I am bringing my own ideologies and prejudices to the results of the Caistor project. And so I will leave it to my successors to unpick what those prejudices actually were. And with many apologies for the technical and other glitches here, I will leave it at that point. But thank you very much for listening and for your patience.
Right, I'm going to attempt to continue. You can stop sharing your screen now if you would like, Will.
Okay.
There we go. I think my voice will just about hold out. It's not great, but I'll do my best. Just looking to see if we've had any questions through. Oh, we do have a bit. Yeah, I think this is a comment more than a question regarding the previous early interpretations of the site from Bob Eden. So a bit of confirmation bias then, which that's putting it mildly, isn't it, really? Everybody, if anyone's got any questions at all, even though the talk's over, please put them through. I hope you didn't cut it short, Will. Just if there's anything else you would like to add, please do so.
No, I mean, I was sort of aware that everyone's time was running. So I suppose I skipped over a couple of details of stratigraphy, but I think that people tend to glaze over with those anyway, so I wouldn't worry about that.
In terms of the palimpsest, are you any closer to sorting it out, or is that a rather daft question?
Yeah, I think we can say some things. We can say things about some of the roads and trackways. Also, the team from the National Mapping Programme have done quite a lot of work on trying to put dates on some of these different features. And yeah, I think with the geophysical survey, clearly dating from geophysics is tricky, if not impossible. But you can make some judgments, and I think I've been through it in quite a lot of detail now, and will ultimately there is a large chapter written on that which is awaiting publication. So yeah, we're getting there.
Okay. I have to say that the diagonal road really intrigues me, particularly with the extremely late dates that you've got for its continued use. Do you have a clear association of the truncation of the road by the late defences, and because the two seemed a bit contradictory? Or
but it's a really interesting point, and I think it's you can see on the geophysics. I mean, as you say, it's cut off by the walls. There's no doubt about that at all. You can sort of see on the geophysics. There's a sense that it actually kind of swings round in the corner, and then sort of runs back along the interior of the fortifications. But the late date for that, like those last resurfacings, is really very, very robust. So it seems to certainly it's being resurfaced sort of 10 meters wide after the fortifications are built. If that is, we accept the late 3rd century date of the fortifications, and the dating of them is by no means secure.
Okay, I think we are. Yeah, a couple of questions coming in from Robert Hutchings. Regarding the width of the wheel ruts, are they the standard width, or do we have variations? I'm assuming he's meaning the usual approximately 5 foot.
It's very hard to tell, because some of them are much more pronounced than others. So it's quite hard to tell, particularly in the sort of quite narrow strips of the sections of the roads that we looked at.
Okay. From Jeff, I don't think it's our Jeff, because he'd know the answer to this one. I noticed that the road from Colchester seems to bypass the walled town. Is that the case?
Yeah, I should have mentioned the road from Colchester, but yes, it runs to the left of the west of the River Taz. So the town is on the east side of the east side of the river, and the road is on the west side. It takes, on the LiDAR imagery and on the geophysics, we've got a clear right-hand turning. So we've got a road that runs through the west gate of the Roman town, and it either fords. I can see something's coming about a bridge in the chat, but there's either a ford or a bridge across the river at that point. And then there are there's at least one other branch of the road that then veers off to the west. So yeah, it sort of bypasses to the west, really.
Right. Okay. Doesn't say who this is from. Were you restricted in terms of the location of the excavation trenches that you dug, or did you have a reason to go to the northwest corner?
We weren't restricted. I mean, we had to say very clearly to Historic England and the Norfolk Archaeological Trust where we wanted to dig. The reason that we went to that northwest corner was there was an indication of what seemed to be a sort of D-shaped enclosure, and there's some interesting, very post-Roman material comes from that northwest corner, and so we were hoping to investigate also the post-Roman activity in the town. So that's as well as section the street. And in fact, we've got some of the best evidence of very, very late or post-Roman activity comes from that northwest corner. So there is something quite interesting going on there.
Okay. We've got a question from Mark Willingdale. I'm sort of going to blend this, Mark, with a question I was going to put myself. Given the disparity in the traditional, if you like, dating of the site and the evidence that you've actually got now, substantially later, what would you say is the earliest evidence for there being anything at Venta at all?
I think there is quite well. We've certainly got quite good Iron Age evidence from the surrounding area, although not from the town itself. There's certainly there's a series of pottery kilns which Vivian Swan identified as late Claudian or Neronian.
Mm-hmm.
So there are things going on there in that period around the revolt. Just not a town, I think. Whether if there is a military presence there, we haven't found it, and I think the evidence for a military presence is quite limited. Although Vivian Swan's interpretation of the kilns were that they were supplying a particular type of tripod and tetrapod vessel used by the military.
Okay. Have you? I noticed on your plan, I've seen an earlier things that I've looked at, that there do seem to be quite a lot of more sinuous trackways that you've identified actually outside the town, but they are tending to focus on the same point. Have you any dating for those trackways yet or not?
No, we don't.
No. So they could either relate to what's happening in the Roman period or potentially something before that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really what we thought about the diagonal road, and we've been proved sort of fundamentally wrong on
that. I can see why you would think that, though. I'd have done the same. I'll move on from Martin Packer. It's tempting to say that the location is because of a nice bend in the river. However, rivers move. So given that, why was Caistor where it was?
How long have you got? This is one of the big questions. The river has moved, but it's never much bigger than it is now. So my best thinking, or my current thinking, for the position of the site is it actually reflecting a pre-Roman cult focus, and certainly the big extramural temple does seem to have pre-Roman origins. So that's where I'm currently at with that.
Do we have much evidence of longer distance Roman roads? You've touched on this already, actually, leading up to Caistor from Colchester, Burgh Castle, and other places. From David Chippett. Apologies, David.
Yes, there are. There's quite good evidence of a range of roads. I would, on this, I'd really recommend looking at the PhD thesis of James Allbone, who did a PhD on the Roman roads of East Anglia, and if you haven't had him to speak to you, I would very much recommend him. Yeah, so there is quite a well traced network of roads in Norfolk.
James is actually one of our longest standing members, but he's never volunteered himself.
Oh well, you should nag him then at that point.
Why were people in the 1920s so believing in the civilizing influence of the Romans? From Jan Scott.
In short, it was because this was when Britain still had an empire, and so people in Britain tended to view empire in positive terms as a civilizing influence on less sophisticated people. And so this view was extrapolated backwards to the Roman Empire, which was viewed in a similar sort of positive and civilizing light. That's really the sort of shorthand explanation, but that seems to be where it principally lies.
Okay. And from Andy Stevenson, the town seems to extend eastwards. I think he's meaning beyond the defences. Is that the case? And do you have any idea of population at its height? Also, what is the latest date of inverted commas Roman occupation?
Okay, so I think yes, it does extend to the east. The latest date of occupation is when you differentiate between Roman and other people, we get into into quite tricky areas. The latest evidence for activity at the site, it seems to remain a place of political importance into the 8th century. But we lose the classic sort of Roman evidence, as we do everywhere in the form of coins and pottery and this kind of thing, in the early 5th century. But you get back to the age-old question as to whether that is evidence of absence or absence
Yes.
of evidence.
Yeah.
And in terms of population, I mean, the number sort of 2,000 is always bandied about, but it's not based on very much. So I think there are various sort of demographic figures that you can apply, and if you apply those at its maximum size, Caistor has a population of about 5,000, but I think that's far too much. I think probably 2,000 to 3,000 is a reasonable punt on the basis of the evidence.
Yeah, I would have thought so, given the density, the quite low building density that you were showing on your reconstructions. That's would seem more realistic. From Susan Rands, the ruts seem to be quite wide apart. Oh, this is very similar to a question we've already had. Any thoughts on wagon axle widths and hence the size of the wagons routinely used on these streets?
No, I think I have, in the sense that I haven't any useful thoughts on it.
No, I think all I can add to that is that there is, in terms of cumulative evidence on from other sites, there is an increasing amount of evidence to suggest that the idea that all wagons had the same axle length, the same gauge, are quite wrong, and there were a variety used. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this, but there is more evidence now pointing in that direction. Whether there's any regionality to it or not is another matter. A lot of work to do. Okay, just bear with me 1 second. Right. From Paul Wood, interesting to hear Will's views on how the settlement appears to reflect the known local population. Oh, it's a question, not a statement. He would be interested to hear Will's views on how the settlement appears to reflect the known local population of the 2nd and 3rd centuries.
In the sense of, yeah, I mean, I think, we have to view this town as a town of it's as the name suggests, it's market. Venta Icenorum is market of the Iceni, yes. And so it's the Iceni. It's a town of the Iceni as much as it is a Roman town, and I think that's sort of what explains some of its idiosyncrasies.
Yes, I think you're probably right. Certainly, if you compare with other Roman towns where you've got plenty of evidence for large segments of the population not being local, as he describes it, it does seem to be quite different. Although I can see some parallels in some ways with a couple of other towns, particularly in the north. Anyway, moving on. From Delwyn Matthews, we always get a question from Delwyn. I was interested in the more recent impression showing roundhouses within the urban settlement. Are there similar examples of this in other towns from the period?
I don't know about roundhouses in urban settlements, but there are certainly, I think, there's certainly good evidence of roundhouses on rural settlements lasting lasting pretty late into the Roman period. Yeah, we've got relatively reasonable evidence. I think the evidence is relatively robust from Caistor, and you can certainly make the case for them. I sort of partly included them in the reconstruction, to sort of be provocative and stimulate some debate. But I think the evidence is pretty good. We've got curving wooden structures that date to the 3rd century.
Yeah, but as you say, in other rural settlements, it's finding round houses alongside relatively high status Roman buildings is quite commonplace. So it's unusual inside a walled town, but not exceptional in terms of the whole settlement pattern, really, is it?
Yeah.
Right, we have another one. Just going to change my screen arrangement, make life easier. They're still coming. From Robert Hutchings. Where did they reused? I'm not sure you actually mentioned reuse.
Building materials, brick and flint. The flint is local. The brick is probably manufactured fairly locally. We haven't found brick kilns, but there's reasonable clay locally. And yes, they were reused. There's a lot of it in the church at present, and the walls of the town were quarried fairly heavily.
From Kevin Cook, it is often said that Venta was a failed town. I think you did touch on that early on. If so, have you an idea why? Was it in the wrong location? Not enough population? It's a bit simplistic, really, to just say it was a failed town, though, isn't it?
I think it's a town that reflects the interests and aspirations of the people who were living there. I mean, by most respects, most towns in Britain are failed towns, in the sense that the monumentality that you see elsewhere in the Roman Empire doesn't really take root in the same way as it does, say in Gaul. So I wouldn't say it's a failed town. I think it's a town that reflects very much what its residents required from it.
I have another question from Mark Willingdale. I'm going to mispronounce something here, I'm sure. Is there any current theory why the main administrative settlement was here rather than on a crossing of the Yar or Yare?
Yeah.
I knew I'd get it wrong first time.
It's it's odd, because in many ways, Norwich is a much more sensible place for a major settlement, and that is ultimately why medieval Norwich develops where it does, and not why Caistor is a field full of sheep. So I think that, as I say, I think it's probably reflecting an earlier cult focus. Is my current thinking.
And hang on. There's a comment rather than a question from Tony Keane, who thinks there's evidence for early roundhouses in London.
Right. Okay. I'll look that up. Thank you, Tony.
From John, no surname. Is it possible that the territory was depopulated after the revolt, and that the Iceni were then population introduced or reintroduced by the Romans?
It's always possible, but there is no evidence for it, and in fact, all the evidence suggests that the impact of the revolt on the Iceni was fairly limited, as far as we can tell from all the archaeology points towards a sort of really significant kind of continuity of settlement, and also things like personal dress, this sort of thing. So yeah, I think I think they're not a new population.
A question about the actual pronunciation. No name.
Okay.
Venta Icenorum, but Iceni. Finicky, somebody's put. And
yeah,
there's a lot of debate about this, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a it's force of habit rather than anything else. Would be people those who specialize in early languages may well have something to say, something useful to say on that, but I don't, I'm afraid.
Names change with time, and they get corrupted depending on who's using them. The Icknield Way, after all, also derives from the same place, the same thing, same source. So now that, I think, is almost the last one. There's one I'm going to come back to because it's not about Caistor. Somebody has asked, seeing as you're in Nottingham, if you have any views on the paucity of Roman remains from that area.
Well, I mean, there's a lot in Nottinghamshire. There's a lot around Nottingham, but yeah, not much from Nottingham itself. There is some at Broxtowe, but yeah, it's pretty limited. So, but I think there's a lot of I think partly you also it's most of the activity is clustered along the Fosse Way. So the current A46 really, so slightly to the south.
I will just add to that, largely because it's a discovery I was involved in. We now know that there is a road on the eastern edge of Nottinghamshire, which runs up from Osmonthorpe to Rossington, and that was identified a couple of years ago, with a possible settlement about halfway up.
Is that the one that's about to be published in the Thoroton?
It has been published in the
right.
Thoroton,
Okay,
yes.
yeah.
But he got to it second. We put it in our newsletter about 6 months before.
Okay.
He just hadn't read the newsletter, even though he's a member. Oh yeah, hey ho. It doesn't matter. The point is, it's out there, and we now know for certain that road exists, and it's early as well, given the sites that it seems to link. So Nottinghamshire isn't entirely off the map.
No, not at all. No.
I'm just going to check again. If there's anything else, Leslie, can you send it through? My voice is just about held out, thankfully, but only just.
Someone asked, is there evidence of a burial site? And yeah, there are. There's late Roman graves on most sides of the town, but we haven't really dug very many of them.
Yeah, that was from Maureen Cubitt, is it pronounced? Yeah. I assume.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, I'll start to wind that up. So thank you very much again, Will. Just to remind all our audience, if you're not already aware, that our next talk in March will be by Andrew Burley, talking, of course, about Vindolanda, which and that is filling up very fast. So if you do want to attend that one, I suggest you make a booking as soon as possible. It only remains for me then to thank not just Will, but the team behind the scenes, who you've seen a bit more of this evening than you normally would. But so that's Jeff, of course, and also Jim, Leslie, and our latest recruit, Hannah. They've all helped everything run smoothly, apart from Will's slight tech issues.
Yeah, no, everything was seamless at your end. It was my end.
Makes a change. I also want to just lastly thank the people who've chosen to make a donation to help us in the running of this. We've been actually overwhelmed by the generosity of people. So all 33 of you made a donation. Thank you very much indeed. And it's gone a long way to making sure that we can continue actually to make this free for most people. And with that, it only remains me to wish everybody a very good night